Welcome. In this video, we're going to talk about how to have parameterized simple data lists in Blackbaud CRM using the Infinity SDK. I'm going to open up CRM and show you a data list. This is a custom data list that I wrote. It just dumps every address in CRM into a big long list. The details aren't terribly important. That's not the point of our lesson today. You can see at the top we have a filter for country. I can filter for Canadian addresses, for example. I can filter for American addresses, and so on. What we're going to do in this demo, or training video, is add a state dropdown to the filters, and we're going to have the country drive the state. In other words, when I choose Canada, the state list is going to show a list of Canadian provinces, and when I choose the United States, it's going to show a list of American states, and so on. Let's look at the spec for this data list. I'm going to jump over to Visual Studio. This is the data list. It isn't very complex. You can see that I have a SQL query that grabs every address in CRM. It translates the state and country, and optionally applies a country ID filter. And you can see that the country ID is a simple data list. This is an out-of-box data list. It's just called the country list or something like that. So let's add a state to our list of filters. I'm going to start by adding it as a form field. I'll call it state ID, and of course it's a data type of a GUID. Everything in CRM is a GUID, right? Caption state, and it's going to be driven by a simple data list. Well, what simple data list shall I use? Let's take a look in CRM. I'm going to go over to Administration, Application, Features, and I'm going to do a simple data list search. And I'll search for the word state. And it gives me a list of, it gives me two possible simple data lists. I'm going to choose the second one, returns all states for the given country. I choose that and I get an ID. Here's the ID of the data list. Sorry, the ID of the simple data list that I want to use. So let's go back over to Visual Studio and paste that in here. And I can't load this spec yet because we haven't modified the SQL to pay attention to that new parameter. So let's add that as a parameter in here, state ID. I'm going to give it a default value of null because if they haven't chosen anything in the dropdown, I don't want the SQL to fail. Now I'll also add it down here, and either they didn't provide a parameter, or if they did provide a parameter, of course we want it to match. Now I'll load the spec. It worked. And if we go back over to CRM, then we should see our new list. We have a country and a state list. So that's fine as far as it goes. I can now filter for example, Colorado addresses, and I get a few. I can filter for California addresses, and I get a few, and so on. That's nice. But what if I choose Canada? That's strange, isn't it? California is still chosen. I would expect there to be no entries in our database in California and in Canada. That would be a data integrity issue for sure. So anyway, the problem is obvious, right? We want this list to reflect Canadian provinces because of the country that's chosen. So let's add a parameter to the state. In other words, state should listen to the country, right? Let's go back to our simple data list. That state list does have parameters. You can see in the description, returns all states for the given country, or all countries if no country is supplied. Okay, and you can see that there's a parameter of country ID. Well, let's fill in that country ID parameter, shall we? Go down here in your spec to the state ID simple data list. I don't want to just populate a simple data list. I want to elaborate on that a little bit. I want to say this simple data list has some parameters. There's a params tag, and you can have as many parameters as you like. We just want one, and it's called country ID. I know that it's country ID because I see that field here. I could also supply include inactive or use default country, but I'm not going to do that right now. Okay, so the parameter country ID. Now, what do I push into the country ID? Well, I want the country ID that they've chosen to go into that parameter, right? So the syntax here is to say fields, ! country ID. This is telling it, hey, you know the country ID that is on the state list? Fill it in using my country ID. This syntax where it says fields is underdocumented. It would be hard to find this on the Blackbaud support site as of this recording anyway. There are a few other options. If you're in a data form, you can say parent.fields, which would be referring to, if you've extended a form, then that would be referring to a field in the parent form that you extended. And there's some metadata fields available if you just say form ! And you could have record ID or context record ID. There are some possibilities here, but this is a simple example. So we'll just use fields country ID. I'm going to load this, and this, spoiler alert, is not going to work because there's something else I need to do. So I've provided the state ID with a country. I loaded the spec, and I'm going to recycle the app pool. And now if I go over here to my list, I'll refresh it. And I think you might expect that if I choose, Canada, I would get Canadian provinces now based on the spec that I entered, but you don't. You still get a list of American states because it's the default country in my environment. So what's going on? Well, we have to write a little bit of .NET code to make our parameter tag take effect. So let's do that. I'm going to copy the full path of this data list. You'll see why in just a moment. And I'm going to create a UI model for this data list. I'll right-click on my UI model project and say Add New Item. And I'll use the UI model wizard. And I'll paste in that file name. That's why I did the copy full path, because it made that step easier. I'm going to generate HTML. We're not really going to use the HTML, but I'll generate it anyway, just in case in the future we ever needed it. And I'll click OK. Okay, so that is going to give me a few artifacts. The UI model wizard creates a VB file, a .NET file or C# if you're using the C# SDK, that is code behind for your form or data list in this case. And it gave me an HTML file, which represents the look and feel of the filters area of my data list. All right, what we want to do, remember, is when the user changes the country, I want to refresh the state list. So we can say that almost verbatim in code. Let's go into our list of events. I can say, hey, the country ID, whenever its value changes, I want to reset the data source of the state. This is sort of the magic word. Not hard, but maybe difficult to discover. But there it is. Now what's going to happen is every time I change the country, the state will refresh. I'm going to build this. I have a post-build batch file that deploys the files properly. You could manually deploy them, of course, if you wanted to. And I'll go over to the data list. The UI model wizard modified this data list. You can see that in addition to the filters I had before and the output fields that I had before, there's now this web UI component tag. The UI model wizard put that there, and it's basically saying, hey, data list, whenever you run, you need to run this .NET code and this and render using this HTML file, not just do the default thing. So I'm going to format that because I don't like the way that it looks. Because this is a change to the spec, I need to load it. So I'll load that. You see that it completed. And now I'll go over to the data list again and refresh this page. So let's look at the filters. Let's choose Canada. Look, I have Alberta, British Columbia, Manitoba, and so on. It's honoring the country that I've chosen. Let's change the country to the United States. Now I have US states, right? That's exactly what we wanted. There are a couple of other things I want to do before we call this done. This line, there's a lot of recording and audio for this one line. This line is sort of the magic word that you need to take away from this lesson. In order to make parameters take effect, you have to call reset data source on the target. That's the real takeaway here. But there are a couple of other things you should keep in mind. So let's create a sort of problem scenario. I just chose a state of Alabama. Let's change over to Canada. Look, an invalid situation has now arisen. If I click this drop down, it's going to show me Canadian provinces. That's correct. But notice that my previous choice is still here. That's not correct, right? So let's add a little bit more code to make this just a little more polished. Whenever I change the country, reset the data source, yes. But also, let's clear out the current value. Let's just set it to an empty good. I'll build that. Now refresh the page. Now let's try that problem scenario again. I'll go to the United States and I'll choose California. That's fine. Now let's change it to Canada. Look, now the state is blanked out. That's better, right? I can't create an invalid filter anymore. You could also, if you wanted to, have the state field light up only when the country is chosen. If you wanted to do that, I don't think in this example it really makes sense, but if you wanted to, you could say, hey, whenever the country changes, I want the state ID only to be enabled if the country ID has a value. If I build that, it's going to change the behavior a little bit. What's going to happen is when I change the country, if I blank out the country, the state's going to gray out. So that's what's going to happen. I'll blank out the country, now the state is gray. And if I choose a country, the state lights up. I don't think you would want that in an address scenario because you might just want to filter for state without any country. But you could also do other things like supply a default country. You could hide or show fields or whatever. All right, I'll stop here because we've gotten our point across. The simple data list, just to recap, if you want a simple data list to pay attention to parameters, you need to do two things. You need to modify the simple data list tag in your spec with a params block. You're going to tell it, hey, for every parameter that you expect, here's a value from my form that you're going to receive. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You also need to create a UI model, and in the UI model, call the reset data source whenever the passed in parameter may change. In this case, whenever the country changes, I want to reset the data source. This is going to make this take effect, and only when you call this will it take effect. All right, please email us at support@steinsoftware.com with any questions, and I look forward to your comments and feedback. Thank you.